Chapter 8, Section 1, The World War I Years. Building background. As Americans were busy settling new territories in the West in the late 1800s, powerful European countries were expanding as well. Many countries rushed to establish colonies around the globe. This race for colonies would eventually play a part in the outbreak of one of the most devastating wars in history, World War I. Imperialism in Africa. For hundreds of years, Western nations such as Spain, Great Britain, and France had controlled colonies around the world. This practice, known as imperialism, gave powerful nations control of the governments and people of weaker nations. Ruling countries benefited tremendously from imperialism, as colonies supplied valuable raw materials such as metals, cotton, and timber for European factories. Because people in the colonies also purchased manufactured goods made in Europe, colonies also served as a market for European goods. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a new wave of imperialism led Western nations to seek out even more colonies. Africa became one of their chief targets. Eager to gain access to rich natural resources, European nations raced to acquire colonies throughout Africa. For example, Belgium's King Leopold II established the Congo Free State in Central Africa. Under his rule, companies exploited the people of the region, who were forced to collect resources such as rubber and palm oil for export. Other nations colonized Africa as well. France and Great Britain controlled much of the continent, including French West Africa and British colonies in Egypt, Nigeria, and southern Africa. Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain also held African colonies. By 1914, only two African nations, Liberia and Ethiopia, remained independent. Angry at the takeover of Africa, opponents of imperialism joined in protest. In 1900, black leaders held the first Pan-African Conference in London. At the conference, people of African descent from the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa gathered to address issues facing blacks, including racism and imperialism. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the organizers of the conference, soon took up the idea of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is the idea that people of African heritage from around the world should work together to achieve freedom and equality. Pan-Africanism would serve as a powerful influence for future black activists. World War I begins. Imperialism eventually led to conflict. As European nations challenged each other for dominance around the world, a tangled system of political alliances and rivalries resulted in increasing tensions. In 1914, those tensions exploded into a war that came to involve all of the world's Western powers. The United States enters the war. World War I began in 1914 when the Empire of Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, a small nation in southeastern Europe. Within weeks, the war in Europe grew more intense as a network of treaties and alliances pulled almost every country in Europe into the fighting. On one side were the Allied powers of France, Great Britain, Italy, and Russia. Opposing them were the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. For 3 years, the United States remained neutral, or chose not to take sides. Despite sympathies for the Allies, most Americans did not want to get involved in a bloody war overseas. Eventually, however, German attacks on U.S. merchant ships and the deaths of American civilians led to increasing outrage. Finally, on April 6, 1917, the United States joined the war on the side of the Allied powers. The call for troops. The U.S. declaration of war had a dramatic effect. Across the country, thousands of men poured into recruiting stations to volunteer for military service. Among those eager to serve their country were African American men. However, as of the beginning of the Civil War, most black volunteers were turned away. African Americans themselves were divided over the issue of serving in World War I. Some black leaders wondered why African Americans who were denied full rights at home should be expected to die overseas to defend freedom for others. Other black leaders, such as Robert S. Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender, and W.E.B. Du Bois, supported the war effort. Du Bois urged African Americans to volunteer for military service in spite of the discrimination they faced at home. History's Voices. Let us not hesitate. Let us, while the war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Crisis, July 1918. In May 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which required men of all races between the ages of 21 and 30 to register to be drafted into the armed forces. African American men were now allowed to serve their country in what was being called the War to End All Wars. Black troops, however, would face discrimination in the armed forces much like the discrimination they faced in civilian life. African Americans in World War I. Many African Americans lent their support to the war effort with the hope that in time their sacrifices would improve their political and social status at home. They believed that, as Du Bois argued, out of the war will rise an American Negro with the right to vote and the right to work and the right to live without insult. Blacks serve in the war. As soon as the United States entered the war, the African American troops already in the armed forces were called to duty. Some 10,000 black troops were already serving in the U.S. Army. Another 10,000 black troops served in the state National Guard units. By the end of the war, some 370,000 African Americans had served in the military. They were segregated into all black divisions commanded by white officers and trained in separate camps away from white troops. Some white Army officers and Southern politicians objected to black troops receiving training with weapons, worrying that African Americans who could use guns might pose a threat after the war ended. As a result, few African Americans were trained for combat. Only 40,000 saw action on the battlefield. Most black troops were limited to non-combat roles, performing behind the front lines in support roles such as drivers and laborers. One African American who saw combat was Eugene Jacques Bullard, the world's first black fighter pilot. Born in Georgia, Bullard lived in Europe as a young man and joined the French Foreign Legion at the outbreak of war in 1914. Bullard eventually served as a pilot in the French Air Force, where he flew on some 20 missions. Despite his distinguished service record, the U.S. Army Air Service rejected him when he sought to fly for his native country. Black pilots were not welcome. Black Army officers. At the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, there were only 3 African American commissioned officers in the entire U.S. military. As hundreds of thousands of black troops joined the military, black leaders protested the military's discrimination against black officers. Black leaders argued that the government should not deny the right of our best Negro men to lead troops of their own race into battle. In May 1917, the U.S. Army finally relented and established a training camp in Iowa for black officers. By the end of the war, this camp commissioned more than 600 black officers, although most were assigned to command black labor battalions serving behind the front lines. Black troops in combat. Only 2 African American units saw combat overseas during the war, the 92nd and the 93rd Infantry Divisions. The 92nd arrived on the front lines in France in August 1918. Many of the unit's soldiers were assigned to build roads, but some members of the 92nd saw heavy fighting against German troops. Many received the Croix de Guerre, the French government's award for military bravery. The 93rd Division saw even more action on the battlefield. The 93rd's most famous unit, the 369th Infantry, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters, was the first all-black U.S. combat unit to be sent overseas during the war. This unit had an impressive war record. The 369th was originally formed as the 5th Regiment of the New York National Guard. After becoming part of the U.S. Army, the 369th shipped out for Europe in December 1917. When the unit arrived in France, U.S. and British Army leaders refused to allow black men to fight alongside their troops. Members of the 369th were given manual labor duties rather than serving on the front lines. In the spring of 1918, the unit was assigned to serve with the French Army. Already accustomed to fighting with black soldiers from France's African colonies, French troops did not object to integrating their forces. When the members of the 369th were finally given the opportunity to fight, they did so bravely. The unit spent a total of 191 days fighting on the front lines. Near the war's end, the 369th became the first Allied unit to fight through enemy lines to reach the Rhine River in Germany. But their service came at a high cost. Almost 1,500 Harlem Hellfighters died in combat. By the end of the war, 171 members of the 369th had received the Legion of Honor, France's highest award. The 2 most highly honored African American soldiers in World War I were both members of the 369th, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts. In May 1918, the 2 men, both privates, were guarding an isolated observation post when a German patrol of some 24 soldiers attacked their post. Johnson and Roberts fought off the attack despite severe wounds and a lack of ammunition. Both were later honored by the French government with the Croix de Guerre for their bravery. Black nurses. Several years before the outbreak of World War I, a group of black women organized the National Association of Colored Nurses. They were determined that African American nurses gain proper recognition for their work and be accepted as professionals. The U.S. Army did not call upon the services of black nurses until just before the end of the war. In September 1918, a devastating worldwide flu epidemic broke out. In desperate need of nurses, the Army sent 18 black nurses to hospitals in Ohio and Illinois. Because of the shortage of medical personnel, these nurses tended both black and white patients and earned high praise from the hospital administrators with whom they worked. After the war. World War I ended in November 1918. When African American veterans returned home, they received little recognition for their sacrifices during the war. The 369th Infantry was honored in a parade for war veterans in New York City, but other areas largely ignored blacks' contributions to the war. Many African American veterans refused to accept these insults quietly. In St. Joseph, Missouri, for example, black veterans would not agree to march at the back of a victory parade, believing that this discrimination went against the democratic ideals for which they had fought. After helping to fight for freedom overseas, many believed that they had earned the right for greater freedoms at home.